You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the nonprofit news outlet exploring solutions for sustainability in water. I am the host, Travis Loop. For this episode, we are going in the newsroom with Todd Votteler of the Texas Water Journal. Todd, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Travis, I've really been looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I really had not spent a lot of time in Texas and really no time in Texas connected to water issues, except for the past couple years. I've finally been able to get down there a few times, do some different stories, especially around Texas Springs and the connection with, groundwater depletion and the health of those springs. And then I seem to have a lot of friends that work in the Texas water sector, especially the utility side of house. And there's probably some misconceptions around the country about water in Texas. Maybe people thinking that Texas doesn't care about it, or there's not a lot of activity, or it might be set back in time, their approach to water. And I just got to say, I've been blown away, pleasantly surprised, excited to learn about everything happening in that state and the attention that there is to water. You've got a lot going on. There's Austin, as part of this tech hub renaissance, if you will, has got water tech popping up around there. And then you've been covering the issues for so long. So I don't really have a question there. It's more of a statement of like, if you're not tuned into Texas water, you should be, because there's a lot going on and there's a lot to learn. So,
Or there is a lot going on, especially this year. So
yeah.
you mentioned springs. I cut my teeth in the 90s on endangered species issues related to groundwater limitations and springs where the endangered species were located. And I worked for the federal judge who had a series of Endangered Species Act cases regarding the Edwards Aquifer, and was eventually a special master for that judge in those cases, trying to find a way to balance back then, the lack of any kind of restrictions on pumping of groundwater in the Edwards Aquifer, and the state mantra that, well, really the rule of capture prevents us from really regulating groundwater use. Well, that federal case, the federal judge I worked for, Lucius Bunton, said, look, Texas, I got to keep these springs flowing to provide habitat for these endangered species. Really, it's much better if you, the state, handle that than if I, as a federal judge, handle. And so, that's what happened. The legislature in 93 created the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and that agency was to limit pumping from the Edwards Aquifer and keep those springs flowing where the endangered species were located. And that triggered state litigation, a case called the Barshop case, which pretty much decided once and for all that it was constitutional in Texas to regulate groundwater. And the justice who wrote the opinion on that case was Greg Abbott, who is the current governor. And,
Wow.
And we just had a very big news item last week from Governor Abbott. Of course, Texas, as you mentioned, is experiencing this phenomenal growth. We've got about 31 million people. By 2050, the state demographer says, well, we could have in between 38 or 42 million people. And so, the state's very focused on how we're going to provide water for those folks and the industries that they're associated with, because they're not bringing any water with them, right?
That's right.
About 1,000 people estimated moving to Texas every day, and not one of them bringing that water. And so the state
I was just going to say, when I was there, you see the phenomenal growth. The big metro areas are just booming, right? Like Austin booming, that corridor between Austin and San Antonio booming. Even Houston, being the fourth largest city in the country, continues to grow. And I think the whole Dallas region too, and parts in between, right? It's
Right.
incredible.
And, as you noted, Austin booming, Antonio as well. San Antonio and Austin on I-35, west of that, state gets pretty dry. When you get out to El Paso, maybe 5 to 8 inches of rain annually. When you're all the way at the Louisiana border and the southern part of the state, 54 inches of rain annually. And so, the state's got a big challenge ahead of it because there's a lot of opposition still to moving water from the eastern part of the state to the western part of the state, and it's also very expensive. And so, the expensive part in may, at least in part, have been solved by the bill that the governor just signed. And so, at the beginning of our legislative session, and the Texas legislature meets every odd year, the beginning of January to the very beginning of June, essentially. And in this session, the governor made an emergency item that need to fund water. And he called for I'm trying to make sure I, I say this right, a Texas size investment in water. And so the legislature, which created a new fund 2 years ago when it met, a new $1 billion fund. And as you mentioned, when we got started, increased funding overall from, about 2.5 billion in some other programs, was looking at, what is really needed to get us where we need to go. And they were kind of, working off this estimate from an organization called Texas 2036, a think tank, which I just finished a big water market study called Texas Water Markets for Texas. And Texas 2036 said, look, we think that when you look at the water supply needs and the water infrastructure needs, we need another $154 billion by 2050 to address all that.
Billion with a B, just making sure that cleared everybody. Yeah,
Right,
wow.
154 billion between now and 2050 is that estimate. And these estimates it's hard to say how accurate they are, but that's the number that people worked off of in the legislature. And so the legislature got together and said, okay, we're going to create a new fund that is going to be $1 billion every year for the next 20 years. And so instead of just a one-off fund that's $1 billion, this is a total of 20 billion over the next 20 years. It totals up to 20 billion. And there was a real debate in the legislature. Hey, how should we allocate this money that we're going to provide for water? Should it all be or mostly be for new water supplies, or should it be mostly for water infrastructure? And they came up essentially with a 50-50 split. And so, they're intending that about 10 billion is going to go for these new supplies that we need, and about 10 billion for our water infrastructure needs. And
Makes a
so,
ton of sense, right? You've got to develop the sources and then you've
right,
got to get it to people, right? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
exactly. So now that that's been passed and signed into law by the governor, it still has to be confirmed by the citizens of Texas through a statewide vote on November 4th. And when you look at the history of statewide referendums on water, it's not always a shoe-in. We had a big plan in 1968 to build, canals all over the state and bring water from Louisiana, and a really massive, you know, uh, water development plan, which failed by a few thousand votes. And so most elections regarding water finance have done better since then. And my guess is that the state and our citizens have recognized the need for additional water supplies, and that this bill will be approved by the citizens as well, November 4th. But we'll see.
I was gonna ask if there's any early polls out there, any polling data showing how this might sit. But I mean, this is very recent news here that the session kind of just closed and the governor signed and
That's right.
everything. So it's very
That's right.
formative right now.
But just a little more background on where the state's been uh, and where it's going. Essentially in the 80s, that's when most of the reservoir construction ended in Texas. And until 2 years ago, the first large reservoir, after a 30-year hiatus was completed in the state. What was going on in the 80s is that was the point at which the state was kind of just, there was a sentiment growing that, we wanted to rely less on federal money. And unfortunately, the state didn't make up the gap at that time. And so uh, in this, century, the state's been moving to address that. And so, now we're getting this, most significant effort of all, this $20 billion. And so that's good news. That the the folks who run the state have recognized that this is an issue if Texas wants to continue the growth that it's seen over the last few decades.
I think I think that's an important point. Is this is very much about growth, communities, economic development, security, resilience on that front. This is not really an environmental issue. This is about really that water we need to keep our communities and cities going and prospering and growing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so we'll see what happens. There's a lot of discussion that the new supplies are going to come from desalination.
I was
Um,
going to ask you about this. Yeah, like this new supply piece. Like what does that mean? Is desal part of that? Is water reuse? That's more of an infrastructure piece, but that's kind of a new supply if you're going to
right.
invest in those projects.
Right.
More reservoirs. Yeah, what's kind of the chatter?
Well, you know, there may be a few more reservoirs, uh, but most of the sites, reservoir sites that were the best, had been developed a long time ago. There are a few that are still around, but many of those are going to result in loss of really important bottomland, hardwood, and other wetland habitats that were uh, down to about 50% of original wetlands in Texas. And so those are a concern. That's a kind of concern to that. But it's looking like we're going to have some major seawater desal plants in the future. Corpus Christi is moving to build one now. There are considerations for others. We do have a growing interest, and we do have more projects in brackish groundwater desalination. But as you mentioned, water reuse. El Paso is just broken ground on a major facility, to go from toilet to tap. And, I suspect you're going to see, you know, similar facilities in the other major cities of Texas once they see how that program works out for El Paso, which, El Paso, that state, part of the state where, you've got maybe 8 inches of rain, that forces you to be innovative, right? And so they are a part of the state that does a lot of things first in the water conservation and new technology area that ends up being replicated in other parts of the state.
Wow. A bunch of things to follow up on there. El Paso first. It's very exciting. They're going to be the first community in the United States to do that direct potable reuse, right? That's the technical phrase. I think you used the toilet to tap phrase in a positive way there. That was used a couple decades ago to really kill water reuse in California as a negative thing. Uh, I think people are getting a little more savvy and realizing, yeah, toilet to technology to tap. There's another
Right,
little T in the middle
right,
right there. But
right.
that's cool I cannot wait. I think that's exciting. And I think that they're not just blazing the way for Texas, they're blazing the way for communities around the country, especially the western part of the US, Colorado River Basin. Um, Desal is interesting, that the big quagmire there is the energy that's needed to push that water, right, and put it through reverse osmosis, et cetera, et cetera. So uh, I guess they've got plans for that too.
Well, Corpus is one of the places where you've got a lot of natural gas that's being, uh, you know, uh, ready for liquefied natural gas transport, right? And so I guess that's one of the natural, advantages of having a plant there. In addition to, other parts of the state where, natural gas is, plentiful, and other supplies, we'll see what other types of energy supplies they tap for those plants. But I think they're going to take advantage of, or, our wealth of natural gas here.
Uh, Want to ask about the groundwater usage and the pressure on groundwater, and maybe what you're hearing on that front, and as it relates to this legislation. The Edwards Aquifer. I swam in Barton Springs in Austin. This
Oh, great.
incredible natural spring. It was a searing hot fall day. Can't remember if it was September or October. Dusty and hot. Got in there for a swim, and that was amazing. They're able to have that because of that salamander, right? That's why that is protected and regulated. But then if you just head down a little bit southwest into hill country, Jacob's Well is an area where it was stagnant and not flowing. And that's an iconic, amazing place. They talked about the pressure on the groundwater from all the
Yeah,
explosive growth.
right.
So, I'm just wondering what ignition might be happening of like, hold on a second, we want to have all these homes, people want to live here. How are we going to balance this out?
Yeah. Well, it's complicated, but the Edwards Aquifer is still really the best example of an aquifer where there's a strict limit on the amount of groundwater that can be pumped, which that limit is subject to cutbacks during droughts, right? And for the other aquifers in the state, most of those aquifers are covered by a groundwater conservation district, but the powers of those districts are much more limited than the
Uh,
Edwards Aquifer authorities.
because of
As
this endangered species ruling, probably.
right,
Yeah.
right. That and having been around when all that was taking shape in the 90s, um, there was a real clash between private property rights and groundwater and the Endangered Species Act. And so, while the issue was decided that yes, you can regulate groundwater, there's been a reluctance to provide groundwater conservation districts with the authority that they need, and the protection from litigation. I mean, they're small districts. Usually, most of them are. A lot of them are single county districts, and they are getting fees from their groundwater well owners, right? And so that's a limited amount of money. And when they have rules that are conflicting with a landowner who's got deep pockets, what they want to do, they're subject to litigation, and that's a tough thing for them. They generally, don't have a very big budget for that, and so that's resulted in a lot of these districts, you know, trying to accommodate uh, uses that, you know, on a, you know, added when they add you add them all up, it's problematic. And Jacob's Well is an example of that. Got a little rain here last few months, not enough to end the drought or fill up the reservoirs, but Jacob's Well flowed for a little while. It's just about stopped flowing again, I think. And, we have uh, gone through the rainy part of the spring. It really ends about the middle of June. And so, we're facing a big test again. What's new in Central Texas and all of West Texas. You look at where the population of the state is, it's really mostly, I-35 line to the east. Out in the western part of the state, they've been in a drought for quite a while. You look at those reservoirs, you look at what's going on there, you look at the Rio Grande, right? Serious situation with the reservoirs in the Rio Grande, federal reservoirs, Amistad and Falcon, and upstream, Elephant Butte in New Mexico. Very little water in Elephant Butte. Uh, that river, the only river in Texas that is in part dependent on snowpack. You know, in southern Colorado, snowpack wasn't that great this year again. And so you got low water conditions, not a whole lot of water in those reservoirs. And you've got this, you know, dispute between the United States and Mexico on how much water from the Rio Conchos, the reservoirs along the Rio Conchos that Mexico's built, are using more and more water. And the people downstream in Texas are, you know, you know, really upset about that. They're saying, look, we need more deliveries from Mexico as part of the treaty in 1944, sorry, and the convention in 1906. And, Mexico's in a tough situation there themselves. A lot of that ag that's grown in those reservoirs ends up in supermarkets in Texas and other parts of the United States. And so it's a complicated issue. And, they're looking at a difficult year in particular on the Rio Grande.
Yeah. Wow. Uh, was there anything else water-wise that happened this legislative session of note? You've got this giant funding mechanism, but was there anything else that caught your attention or made the news there?
Well, there are a few things. One is that kind of a surprise, the governor vetoed a water bill yesterday, it looks like, and put out an announcement that he's going to hold a special session, which is it's a situation where the governor calls the legislature back after the regular session has concluded, uh, and he says, I want you to focus on, some specific items. Well, one of the items he has mentioned is this bill that he vetoed. And so we're all kind of scrambling this morning in the water community to figure out what that is, specifically about. We haven't seen the veto message from the governor's office yet. We're all kind of wondering about that. So that means all of a sudden, oh, there's going to be a little bit more um, activity in terms of the legislature on water this summer when we thought we might be done with that. And so that is certainly one of the things that's caught everybody's attention. As for the other items, as you mentioned, Texas Plus Water is the monthly newsletter that the Texas Water Journal, the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University, and the Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M, we put that out every month. And there's a summary in our June issue of the bills that were passed and sent to the governor and the ones that the governor had signed, and we were waiting for the governor to sign. And so, anybody can go ahead and take a look at that and see what's happened. Now,
Yeah, I
later in the
have,
summer,
FYI, I have that, pulled up on my, browser here and was looking through and, again, just interesting to see all the activity, around water and all the very nuanced issues too.
right, right. Some of them you look at those and you think, wow, they're really getting into the weeds in these water policy issues. Um, and it's funny, but the key committees for water in in the 90s, those were not the key committees people wanted in the legislature wanted to be on. That changed once the state Supreme Court said it's constitutional to regulate groundwater because now lots of groundwater districts had to be created. And so members were, in had those districts in, their groundwater districts in their, legislative districts. And so that's changed. And so there's lots of interest in those committees from the members. And as a consequence, there are more water bills filed every session, it seems like. We had another record number this session. And but when the smoke clears, the Texas Water Journal will publish around September 1st our biennial article with the point of view of six of, the, I guess you call them water warriors or water buffaloes here in Texas, what their opinions are as to what the legislature accomplished and did not accomplish. And so we put that together after every session to give a wide range of perspectives on that question.
Very interesting. Well, Todd, I have followed along your work for many years and learned a lot through it. Like I said in the beginning, if people aren't following the Texas Water Journal, and I encourage them to, not just to learn about water in Texas, but it's just a lot of good thought provoking content and gives you good perspective. And I'm glad to finally have a formal conversation with you here on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, Travis. And anybody who wants to sign up for the Texas Water Journal or Texas Plus Water, all those are free. We don't charge for any of that. Just Google and you can find a way to register. I would love to have you on my podcast, Talk Plus Water, at some point in the future.
I'd love to do it. Like I said, I've made a few trips and have some perspective, maybe a different perspective from visiting from the outside. But let's make a plan. Todd, good talking to you. You take care.
Thanks, Travis. I've really enjoyed this.
You're in the water loop.
Water loop, water loop, water loop.